Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Heebie Cheebies TV. My name is Ashley, and on this channel, we like to talk about the paranormal, true crime, and unsolved mysteries. Now, today's story is a wild one, 100% one of the craziest stories I have ever come across. I'm actually quite surprised that it hasn't been turned into a movie or some sort of documentary. But before we get into the story, just want to send you guys a quick reminder to please comment, like, subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. It really does help me grow here on YouTube. All right, so let's get into the story. Now, Linda Chen was born in 1977 in China, and when she was only 15 years old, she ended up moving to Falun in Sweden by herself. Now, her family would eventually join her, but during that time, she was living in a refugee shelter by herself while she waited for her family. And while she was there, she actually ended up meeting a woman called Ano Johansson, who ended up being like a supplemental mother to her. And in the long term, she spent a lot of time with Linda, and she really got to know her and ended up becoming one of her lifelong friends. And if you were to ask Ano about Linda or how she would describe her, she would say that Linda was a very fun person. She was a very lively person. She loved fashion, makeup, dressing up, and she really enjoyed singing karaoke. So Linda grows up and eventually she meets a man who she falls in love with, and they end up getting married, and eventually they end up having a child together, which would be Linda's only son. Sadly, though, it didn't last because her husband would become violent with her, so much so to the point that he ended up getting charged with attempted murder on Linda, and this, of course, ended up resulting in their divorce. Not wanting to fully give up on love, Linda ended up dating, and she ended up marrying 2 more times, but sadly those marriages only ended up lasting a couple more years. Then in 2008 is when Linda met a man called Mats Alm, and this is where her life would change forever. So here's a little backstory on Mats. So he was born in 1975, also in Sweden. And after high school, he had decided he wanted to join the army. So he enlisted, but he didn't want to finish his service term in the army. So he had put in a transfer to finish out his service as a firefighter, which he did. Looking for some more adventure, he actually ended up moving to Peru for about a year, and that's where he would meet his first wife. Eventually, they would become engaged, and feeling the pressure to pay for this wedding, he started stealing money from his job in Peru. He was actually working at a convenience store, and he started embezzling money to the total sum of approximately $10,000. Using this money, they were able to get married, but eventually his job did find out that he had stolen all these funds. So of course they fired him, they pressed charges. He was in jail for a little bit of time, but eventually he was able to get out, and sadly, who wouldn't, but their marriage ended up falling apart. His wife wanted no part in that, so they ended up getting divorced, and this ended up forcing Mats to move back to Sweden. Soon after his return to Falun, Sweden, that's where he met Linda. And during this time, he didn't have any money, he didn't have a job, he actually had quite a lot of credit card debt, and he had taken out a student loan because he was in the process of becoming a teacher. So he was basically living off of his student loan. And the way it works is that you get a student loan at the beginning of the school year, and sometimes it's usually more than what you need, and it allows you to kind of live off of it, especially if you're studying full time and you can't really have a job. So he was using that to live off of at the time. Except during the summer, by the time the school year ends, you kind of start to run out of money. So in March 2008, both Linda and Mats decided to sign up for online dating. This is where they would actually end up meeting, and they started chatting online. They started flirting, the conversation was going well, and eventually they decided to meet up for a first date. And surprisingly, on that first date, they actually ended up talking about marriage. And following that first date, it was only a matter of weeks before Mats had actually moved in with Linda. However, this didn't fully sit well with Linda. even though she was married multiple times before, she didn't feel fully comfortable living with Matt's not being married. So she said to him that if they were going to live together, then at a minimum, they should at least be planning a wedding. So 2 months later, after their initial first date on May 5th, the couple ended up becoming engaged, where it's believed that Matt proposed to Linda. However, if you ask Linda's friends, they actually say that Linda was the one that proposed to Matt. So newly engaged, the couple starts talking more and more about money, and this is where Matt starts asking Linda to help him with this current financial situation. And it would later be discovered that within 2008 and 2009, so just 1 year, Linda had actually given Matt approximately $10,000 to pay off debt and to help him actually live. Then on May 12th, just a week after they had gotten engaged, the couple decided to set up life insurances on each other, with the other one being the beneficiary of that life insurance, and each one was worth approximately $125,000. Linda also wanted Matt to set up a trust and to put her money into that trust in order to make sure that it would go to her son when he turned 18. Part of this reason was because she wanted to make sure that her first husband, the father of her child, did not come after her money in case anything were to happen to her. And with that, they agreed that the money would go to her son. So fast forward to 2009, the couple decides to go on a vacation to China to meet Linda's family. However, it wasn't just an ordinary trip. It ended up being quite expensive. They were there for a month, but Linda was the one that actually ended up paying for the entire vacation, almost $10,000. And on top of that, soon after they started planning their wedding, and eventually they decided on a wedding date, which would be August 8th, 2009. And it was also decided that Linda would pay for the wedding. Now, Matt didn't fully want her to pay for the wedding. He kept telling her that he would pay her back, but Linda really wanted to at least pay for the wedding to get things moving. So she actually ended up fronting $6,000. Now, this is where the story takes a turn. On August 1st, 2009, Linda disappears. At 4:10 p.m. that day, Linda arrives home from her shift at a restaurant where she worked called the China Thai restaurant. According to Matt's, at approximately 4:20 p.m. after Linda had gotten home, they both get in the car to go grocery shopping. And at 4:38 p.m., they were actually caught on CCTV footage at the grocery store. So you can see here Linda with Matt's entering and exiting the store. She was last seen wearing a summery white dress with white leggings and high-heeled sandals. So they drive back home and unload all of the groceries, and then they decide to get back in the car and actually go on a 3-hour road trip across the region. So the point of this trip was to go sightseeing, pick out some spots that they wanted to bring Linda's family when they arrived from China for the wedding. They wanted to kind of, give them a tour of the city and show them how beautiful Fallon was. They also ended up driving to the location where their wedding reception would be. They wanted to check out the place, kind of just get a little bit of a preview, hype themselves up a little bit. They were excited that their wedding was approaching. So when they get to the location of their wedding reception, Matt claimed that there was not a lot of people. It was kind of quiet, except for this one family reunion that was taking place, which he said had approximately 60 people. After that, they decided to go home, and at approximately 8 p.m., they arrived back home. After they get home, Linda makes some food for the both of them, and around 8:30, she actually starts to get ready because she tells Matt that she was going to go out with a friend of hers. So she washes her hair, she does her makeup, but she doesn't change her clothes, which actually ended up coming off as extremely suspicious to her friends, especially Ano Johansson, because she said that it was very odd for Linda to, go through the trouble of washing her hair, doing her makeup, getting ready to go out for a fun night out, but not bothering to change her clothes that she had been wearing the entire day. So, that kind of came off as strange to people. But Mats goes on to say that at 9 p.m., she ends up leaving. She tells him that she's meeting up with her friend called Tony Chen, and that would be that. And according to Mats, that was the last time he had ever seen her alive. So on August 2nd, between 1:09 a.m. and 8:38 a.m., Matt says that he actually ended up calling and texting Linda's phone quite a lot of times, but wasn't getting any answers. So at 9:01 a.m., he calls the police to report Linda missing. But unfortunately, they told him that, to call back later, she was probably still with her friends and not to worry about it. So he continues calling and texting Linda, but no response. So at 10:40 a.m., he calls the police again, only to be told the exact same thing. So he spends the rest of the day calling and texting Linda, but he's still not getting any responses. So finally at 4 p.m., he calls the police one last time to tell them that she's still not home. And at this point, that's when the police finally take him seriously and the investigation begins. At the same time, this is when the news station started to pick up on the story, and it was on the TV, it was being printed in the newspapers, and sadly, this is also how Linda's friends, including Eno Johansson, ended up finding out that she was missing. So on August 3rd, Linda's family arrived from China. They were arriving for their wedding, which was supposed to take place in only 5 days on August 8th. And, they were expecting to arrive to a very happy situation. They were all super excited about the wedding. But instead of arriving to, a happy family reunion, they actually ended up searching for Linda high and low across Fallon. And they even hired a psychic to help them in the search. On August 6th, the police interviewed Tony Chen. Now, this would make sense, right? Because according to Mats, this was the person that Linda was supposedly meeting with the last day she was seen alive. But when police interview with Tony, to their surprise, Tony ends up telling them that he never had plans with Linda. And even more surprising, he said that him and Linda were not actually friends. They were more so like acquaintances. And the reason that they knew each other was that Linda worked at the restaurant, the China Thai restaurant, and he would often go there because he also had friends that worked there. So that's kind of how they got to know each other, but that was the only time they would actually socialize. On August 7th, the police start interrogating Linda's first husband, but fortunately for him, he had a solid alibi and he was ruled out rather quickly. That same day, more of Linda's family arrives for the wedding, and they actually end up meeting with Mats, where surprisingly, he doesn't tell them that Linda is missing at all. He actually ends up acting like everything is completely fine. He starts showing them pictures of the trip to China together. He starts talking about the wedding. He starts completely acting the opposite way you would expect someone to act in that situation. And then on August 8th, the day of their wedding, they actually ended up holding a vigil at the church where they were supposed to get married in hopes of, praying and finding Linda alive. After the ceremony, Mats was actually seen going out with some of his friends, and he was seen drinking and partying at a bar till the late hours of the morning. On August 17th, Mats actually ended up getting a new job as a substitute teacher, and his colleagues at this school all claimed that he was acting super normal. He was happy. He was excited to be starting a new job. There was no indication that his fiance was missing at the time. On August 21st, Eno Johansson actually ends up calling Mats, and in their conversation, it actually ended up coming up about how long it takes to declare a missing person as deceased. Now, this was an odd question, but Eno ends up answering Mats and tells him that it can take up to 10 years to declare someone as legally dead, to which Mats responds something very weird. He tells her, "I simply can't wait that long." Then on September 2nd, Mats actually goes on a true crime show called Efterlist, where he pleads and begs for Linda to come home. Then on September 15th, police start looking at Mats a little closer. So up until then, they had interviewed him several times, but they did notice that his behavior was kind of weird. So on top of what everyone else was saying about his behavior, whenever the police would interview him, they noticed that it seemed like he was faking it or acting. Whenever he would talk about Linda, in the middle of his sentences, he would just burst out screaming like he was in pain, but there were never any tears. Police also noticed an odd red mark on his neck that he simply couldn't explain. He just kept telling them he didn't know how it got there. So with all of this odd information, the police asked him to come in for another interview on September 16th. That day at school was the first time any of his colleagues and friends reported as seeing Matt behaving quite oddly. He seemed very nervous, upset, and just not like himself. So September 16th comes and goes, and Matt is nowhere to be seen. He misses his appointment with the police, and this is where the story takes another crazy turn. On September 18th, a man is seen running out of the woods, frantically flailing his arms around, running down the highway, trying to get cars to stop. And when that doesn't work, he actually runs back towards the woods, towards where there are these cabins. This particular area was quite popular for cottages and people's second homes when they just want to take a break in the woods. So he's seen running towards these row of cabins, where he gets to the closest one and he starts banging on the door. He bangs until someone opens, and a man called Lars Goffin ends up opening the door, and to his surprise, he is shocked at what he sees. He sees a man that is almost naked. He had no shirt, no pants, no shoes on, banging the door. He is clearly distressed. He's screaming, saying that he needs help. And he also noticed that this man had some light burn marks across his body. In the middle of his screaming, this man ends up telling Lars that he is Matt's that he needs help, and that he has found Linda. So he calls 112, which is the equivalent of 911, and gives Matt some water, which he ended up throwing all over himself. He gives him a blanket to keep warm while they wait for the authorities to arrive. Police and paramedics arrive as quickly as they could and actually take Matt to the hospital, where he would tell them a completely insane story about where he had been for the past 3 days. On September 15th, Matt says that he went to a local pizza shop to go buy himself some pizza for dinner. Around 8:30 p.m., he went home to watch some TV. Soon after, he ends up hearing a knock on the door. Not expecting anyone, he found it a little odd, but he gets up and he looks through the peephole to see who's there. He then says he sees a man that he thought was Tony Chen. So he opens the door, and to his surprise, it wasn't Tony at all. It was two Chinese men who were armed with a knife. They force themselves into the apartment with the knife, of course, and they end up giving Matt 2 pills and tell him that he needs to take these right away. As he's taking these pills, they tell him that they're going to take him to go see Linda. So he doesn't fight it, and he ends up taking the pills, sits down on the couch, and he ends up passing out. The next day, on September 16th at approximately 7 p.m., Matt says that he wakes up and he quickly realizes that he is inside a car trunk. He bangs on the trunk, trying to see if he can get help. He just wants to get out. So he bangs on the trunk multiple times. And that's when the 2 men who had entered his apartment open the trunk, and they aggressively ask him where Linda's money is. Max tells them that he has absolutely no idea what they're talking about. He doesn't know anything about any money. So the 2 men give him 2 more pills, some water for him to take the pills, and then they close the trunk. The next day, on September 17th, at around 9:30 a.m., the same thing happens. Matt wakes up and he starts screaming and banging on the trunk, telling them that he needs to pee. The 2 men open up the trunk, and hearing his screams and pleads that he needs to use the bathroom, they give him a cup to relieve himself, and they also ended up giving him some leftover bites of fried shrimp and beef chop suey before asking him again about Linda's money. Again, Matt tells them that he has absolutely no idea what they're talking about, so the 2 men give him 2 more pills again, some water, and then they close the trunk. That same day at around 2 p.m., Matt wakes up again and he starts screaming and banging on the trunk, telling them that he needs to use the bathroom again. The 2 men open up the trunk, and this time they help him out of the car, and they actually allow him to relieve himself right next to the car. And this is when Matt noticed that they were actually in the middle of the woods. They then give him 2 more pills, some water, and they put him back in the trunk. On September 18th, the following day, at around 12:30 p.m., Mats wakes up again, screaming that he needs water, and it was the same thing. The 2 men open up the trunk, they give him what he asks for, they give him some water again, and then they shut the trunk again. Then later that day, at around 4:30 p.m., Mats wakes up, but he's not in the car anymore. He notices that he's actually on the ground and that he's on fire. Freaking out, he removes his shirt, he stands up, and he also notices that his pants were on fire, so he removes his pants as well and his shoes. He starts freaking out. He's looking around his surroundings, and that's when he sees something horrifying next to him. Right next to him was the body of a woman wearing a white dress, on fire, with a bunch of branches and pieces of wood on top of her. Right away, he knew this was Linda, so he freaks out and runs for help. This is when he's seen running onto the highway and eventually running to the cabins. It turns out that this was the body of Linda, but according to the coroner, unfortunately, her body had been so badly decomposed and burnt that it was impossible for them to give an exact date of death, and they also could not say with confidence how she had died. The only thing they could estimate is that she had died somewhere between August 1st and August 9th. So with this crazy story, the police start taking a deeper look at Mats in order to verify his claims. That's when police realized that something just wasn't adding up. They start taking the timelines that Mats was giving them, but they actually ended up finding a completely different story. And this is what the police were able to put together. So on the night that Linda had allegedly disappeared and had gone out to meet Tony Chen, someone had logged into their home computer at approximately 8:20 p.m. On top of this, there were no witnesses that were able to corroborate their story of what they had done that day after the grocery store. There was no one that saw them taking the road trip. There was no one that saw them at the reception. And there was also no one that saw Linda leave the apartment complex that evening. On September 16th, the day after Mats was allegedly kidnapped, someone was using Mats' camera to take photos across Stockholm, and they actually ended up taking a selfie of themselves. Now remember, this is supposedly at the same time that Mats is locked up inside of a car trunk in the middle of the woods. Coincidentally, the person that ended up taking these selfies looked very similar to Mats. On September 17th, again at the same time that Mats was supposed to be tied up in the car trunk, someone uses his computer to log onto the Wi-Fi at the Stockholm library. This is where police discover that there were several searches done, and these searches were done on Mats' ex-wife, a former student friend of his, and a former friend of his from high school. Then again, around 2 p.m., Mats' laptop then logs and connects onto the Wi-Fi on a bus in Stockholm. Several witnesses were able to corroborate that they did see a man that looked quite similar to Mats on the bus, including the bus driver that day. On September 18th, the day that Mats allegedly woke up on fire, several witnesses ended up reporting to police that they saw a man that looked very similar, if not identical to Mats, in an area called Talberg. After Mats had failed up to show for his police interview on the 16th, police put out an APB and let everyone know, the news stations and newspapers, that they were looking for him. He was a person of interest in the disappearance of Linda Chen. So these people, having seen this on the news, they saw Mats, and so they reported it to the police right away. So with that information in hand, the police actually go back to Mats and start asking some very difficult questions. First, they ask him about his camera and the selfie on the camera. How could he possibly be in 2 different places at the same time? Now, I'll put the picture so you guys can see here, and it does look quite similar to Mats, if not identical. It probably most likely is him. And, Mats acknowledges this. He says that they do have a similarity, but he denies that it's him in the picture. And instead of falling apart and, admitting any involvement in this, he actually ends up doubling down on his story. He says that the 2 men that kidnapped him from his apartment actually ended up hiring a body double that looked identical to him and had him travel around Sweden, taking photos of himself, placing himself at different locations in order to frame him for Linda's murder. However, the police were very confused about this statement. Why would anyone kidnap you in order to frame you, but then try to kill you before they were actually able to frame you? It just wasn't adding up. Police then end up finding a handwritten note with his camera and his laptop at his parents' house. Matt claims that this letter was not written by him, but the handwriting was identical to him, and it was later determined that he was the one that wrote this letter. And in the letter, it basically said that he was out tracking Linda's killer, and that if he didn't make it back, then something had happened to him, and that if something did happen to him, he wanted his family to know that he loved them very much. And when he was originally taken to the hospital after being found in the woods, doctors ran a toxicology report on him because they obviously wanted to know what drugs he had been given. But to their surprise, he had absolutely zero trace of drugs in his system. And on top of this, experts suggest that if he had indeed been kept in a trunk for that long, his body would have shown signs of trauma, which there were absolutely no signs of. Now, it seems obvious what happened here, but the problem is that all the evidence here was quite circumstantial. There was no hard evidence to prove that Matt was responsible for Linda's death. All they were able to really charge him with was desecration of corpse, because they were able to prove that he was the one that had set Linda's body on fire. And for this, he ended up receiving 1.5 years in prison. However, because Matt had been held in jail awaiting trial, they took time served and applied it to his sentence. So he basically only served a couple months more after his sentencing, and then he was released. And to this day, he maintains his innocence, that he had nothing to do with Linda's death. And the cherry on top, and I guess the only good thing to come from the story, was that Matt did end up receiving Linda's life insurance payout, but his attorney was able to convince him to give it to Linda's son, which he did end up doing. So as for theories, I guess we can all clearly see where this is heading. However, like I said earlier, there's absolutely no evidence, or not sufficient evidence, to prove that Matt, without a doubt, actually committed this crime. However, as I was going through this story, there were quite a lot of odd things that stuck out to me that made it seem like this was just a completely made up story, especially the parts where he says that the robbers kept giving him water to take the pills. It just doesn't seem likely or probable that if someone is kidnapping you and giving you pills, that they would be kind enough to give you water to swallow them with, or that he was kept in the trunk, or that he wasn't, assaulted during this entire time. I'm sure that if someone kidnaps you, you're going to have a little bit of damage done to your body, but there was absolutely no signs of this on his body. Now, a popular theory going around is that Matt basically wanted Linda's money, and he wanted the life insurance money as well. So he ends up killing her, dumps her body in the woods, and was in the middle of planning an exit strategy. However, when he realized that he couldn't wait 10 years to get her money, or that he didn't have enough money to actually create an exit strategy, he started focusing on plan B. He decided that he would end up, taking his own life in the middle of the woods, and he would end up making it look like a murder, as if someone had killed both him and Linda. However, when it came down to it, he likely chickened out, he backed out, he realized he couldn't do it, so he decided to create this completely insane story about being kidnapped and then ultimately being the one to find Linda's body. And that's where the story ends today. Today, Matt is a free man, still living in Sweden. And unfortunately, there's just no way to prove that he was the one that killed Linda, because her body had been so deeply decomposed by the time it was found. Of course, like I said, there's no evidence to prove this, but her family to this day believes that he was responsible for her death. Alright, well, that wraps up this crazy story. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you guys have any other case suggestions, any other paranormal stories, or some crazy true crime or unsolved stories, leave them in the comments below. I would love to take a look. Thanks so much for joining me on this story, and I will see you guys in the next video.